BZP, New Zealand's legal high experiment. Welcome to Substances Through Time, the channel where chemistry, culture and chaos collide. Here, we dive deep into the strange, surprising, and sometimes downright unbelievable journeys of the world's most infamous substances. And today's story, it's one for the history books. Or maybe the dance floor. We're talking about BZP, a forgotten pharmaceutical that re-emerged decades later not as medicine, but as the legal high that hijacked a nation. It was sold in corner stores, swallowed by the millions, and sparked an entire subculture of wired teenagers, controversial entrepreneurs, and one of the boldest drug experiments in modern history. From lab bench to rave scene to political battlefield, this is the rise and fall of BZP, the party pill that almost changed everything. Origins and creation. Let's go back to the 1940s. The world was just coming out of a war. Antibiotics were revolutionizing medicine, and pharmaceutical companies were racing to crack the code on mental illness. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a little compound called Benzylpiperazine, or BZP, was born in a lab. Now, this wasn't a party drug in the beginning. Far from it. BZP started its life as a potential treatment for depression. Researchers were fiddling with all kinds of chemical structures to find something that could lift people's moods without making them twitch, sweat, or explode into song. They were looking for calm clarity. What they got with BZP was kind of the opposite. Initial studies showed BZP had stimulant properties. That's science speak for. It made rats bounce off the walls. Instead of making you feel soothed and steady, it revved you up like a cheap energy drink mixed with panic. Lab animals got jittery. Test subjects reported feeling agitated, amped, anxious. One researcher allegedly wrote that BZP was like giving someone a double espresso and then locking them in a crowded elevator. Needless to say, it did not make the cut for clinical use. No big launch. No happy commercials with smiling people dancing in fields. BZP was quietly shelved, stored away in some dusty pharmacology archive. The world moved on. Pharmaceutical giants turned to other molecules, tricyclics, SSRIs, drugs that played nicer with the human brain. For decades, BZP was forgotten. It lurked in the chemical back catalogues, a failed antidepressant, known mostly to pharmacologists, researchers, and the occasional niche chemist who liked flipping through old patents. There was no market for it, no movement behind it, no particular reason to care. Until the 1990s. This was when designer drugs started bubbling up through the underground again. People were experimenting, not just with traditional substances, but with the leftovers, the oddballs that had been tested once and tossed aside. Chemists began to re-examine these forgotten compounds, and BZP, with its amphetamine-like buzz, stood out. After all, it wasn't illegal, at least not in most places, and it made people feel awake, energized, social. Dangerous, potentially, but from a legal perspective, it was in the gray zone. Then came the turn of the millennium. While most people were freaking out about Y2K and what would happen to their microwaves at midnight, some folks were working on something a little more intense. In New Zealand, a country that had seen a sharp rise in methamphetamine use, the government and entrepreneurs alike were looking for solutions. Harm reduction was a growing idea. The belief that if people were going to use drugs anyway, they might as well be offered safer alternatives. Enter Matt Bowden, a musician, artist, and perhaps most importantly, a man with an unusual interest in pharmacology. He wasn't your typical anti-drug advocate, quite the opposite. He believed drugs could be part of society, if managed responsibly. Matt wanted to find a legal substance that could replace the far more destructive methamphetamine, something that gave users a similar sense of euphoria and energy, without the crushing addiction, teeth grinding, or 6-day sleep deficits. And that's where BZP re-entered the chat. Matt and others discovered that this obscure compound, abandoned decades earlier, could actually be manufactured at scale and distributed legally in New Zealand. It wasn't classified as a controlled substance. It wasn't banned. It was a loophole, a chemical blind spot. And in that loophole, Matt saw an opportunity. BZP was cheap to make. The ingredients were accessible. And the effects? They ticked a lot of the right boxes. It made people talkative, confident, wired, but still in control, at least for a few hours. With the right packaging and branding, it could pass as a clean, smart, modern alternative to street drugs. And so, BZP was rebranded, not as a failed antidepressant, not as a pharmaceutical footnote, but as a lifestyle enhancer, a party pill. It was sold in capsules, often blended with other legal stimulants like trifluoromethylphenylpiperazine. Try saying that 5 times fast, and put on store shelves like it was an herbal supplement. It was the start of something wild. A new chapter not just for BZP, but for drug policy, youth culture, and the limits of legality. And it all began because someone dug through the chemical trash pile of the 1940s and asked, "Wait, can we sell this?" The business of buzz. By the early 2000s, BZP had re-emerged. Not in a lab report, not in a government memo, but in plastic Ziploc bags sold next to chewing gum. And no country leaned harder into this chemical comeback than New Zealand. At the heart of it all was a man named Matt Bowden. Now, if you're picturing a slick pharmaceutical executive with a lab coat and a boardroom, forget it. Matt was a rock musician, a self-described futurist. He wasn't in it for the money, or at least that's how the story goes. He said he wanted to reduce harm. Methamphetamine was tearing through New Zealand's communities, and he believed BZP could be a solution, a softer, safer substitute that could meth's place without all the destruction. But whether his motivation was public health or a visionary marketing opportunity, Matt moved fast. He branded BZP as a party pill, gave it shiny names like Pep, Frenzy, and Charge, and launched an industry almost overnight. His company, Stargate International, became the flagship of the movement. He even gave himself the nickname, the Godfather of BZP. Modest. Not really. Effective. Absolutely. And here's where it gets weird. The whole thing was legal. BZP wasn't on any controlled substance list. No special license required, no underground networks. You could walk into a dairy, that's a local convenience store, and pick up a 6-pack of BZP capsules like you were grabbing gum on the way to work. Some shops even offered loyalty cards. The pills were usually sold in flashy packaging, complete with dosage instructions, flavor names, and branding that mimicked energy drinks. Marketing leaned heavily into the nightlife scene. Ads targeted young adults, students, club-goers. The idea wasn't subtle. Take one of these and you're going to have a great night. And they did, for a while at least. At its peak, the BZP industry was pulling in tens of millions of dollars a year. Some estimates say over 5 million pills were sold annually. That's in a country of just 4 million people. It's safe to say, at one point, New Zealand was the party pill capital of the world. Entrepreneurs sprang up everywhere. Mom-and-pop operations, internet retailers, boutique suppliers. There were startups importing raw ingredients, labs formulating custom blends, graphic designers whipping up logos with lightning bolts and neon skulls. You could even buy his and hers versions, one for energy, one for, let's say, enhanced intimacy. Everyone wanted in, and it wasn't just kids in clubs. There were stories of professionals, lawyers, nurses, delivery drivers, taking BZP to power through shifts. Some businesses reported employees showing up on Monday still wired from Saturday. A few bosses even encouraged it quietly, because productivity spiked. No one was falling asleep at their desks anymore. Of course, they weren't blinking much either. For a moment, it felt like New Zealand had cracked the code. A legal stimulant that gave you energy, confidence, and sociability, all without the baggage of hard drugs. It was sold openly, taxed, and even debated in Parliament like a consumer good. Some politicians argued it should stay legal and regulated. Others called it a public health disaster in the making. But here's the thing about a gold rush. It never lasts. The growing popularity of BZP caught the attention of journalists, researchers, and eventually the medical community. Reports of adverse effects started stacking up. People were taking more than the recommended dose, mixing it with alcohol, chasing the high beyond what the drug was ever designed for. What started as just a bit of fun was beginning to unravel. Still, in those early years, before the full consequences were understood, the BZP business was booming. Some sellers made small fortunes. Others crashed and burned trying to ride the wave. One thing was clear. BZP wasn't just a drug. It was a product, a brand. And for a brief moment it looked like it might go global. There were whispers of exporting it to Europe, Australia, even the US. Matt Bowden gave interviews where he talked about revolutionizing drug policy through the private sector. He envisioned a world where safe, regulated highs replaced the chaos of street drugs. He framed it not as rebellion, but as evolution. Whether you saw it as harm reduction or opportunism, the business of BZP was undeniably bold, and like all bold ventures, it was racing on borrowed time. Cultural takeover. When a drug makes the jump from underground curiosity to supermarket counter impulse buy, it doesn't just change the law, it changes the culture. And with BZP, that cultural takeover in New Zealand was fast, loud, and at times completely absurd. Let's paint the picture. It's 2005. You're 20 years old. You and your friends are getting ready to go out, but instead of finding a sketchy dealer or downing a bottle of something, you swing by the local dairy, spend $20, and walk out with a pack of government-taxed, shrink-wrapped party pills. You don't need a fake ID. You don't need a secret handshake. All you need is an appetite for mayhem and maybe a bottle of water for later. That ease of access turned BZP into something more than a drug. It became a social ritual. Clubs were packed with people glowing under UV lights, jaw-clenching, sweating through their shirts, and talking to strangers like they were long-lost siblings. The pills made you feel euphoric, chatty, even invincible. People described it like ecstasy, but legal and way cheaper. It wasn't just in the clubs either. University campuses became BZP havens. Students were taking it before parties, before lectures, even before exams. There were stories of people typing full essays in one sitting, not remembering a word of it afterward, but somehow still getting B+s. At one point, some professors half-joked that they could spot a BZP-fueled essay from a mile away. Incredibly detailed, slightly manic, and usually submitted at 3 a.m. And then there was the workplace. Some employees, especially in high-pressure or manual labor jobs, started popping BZP to stay focused. You'd have tradies showing up to construction sites buzzing like high-voltage wires. Night shift workers taking it just to keep their eyes open. Even office workers were rumored to keep capsules in their desk drawers, just in case the Monday morning meeting was too much to bear. There was a brief, bizarre period where BZP-fueled productivity became an open secret. Employers weren't necessarily endorsing it, but they weren't exactly asking questions either. If your whole team hit their targets ahead of schedule and no one took a lunch break, was that really such a problem? Maybe. Maybe not. Depends who you ask, and how many pills they were on when you asked them. But the cultural reach of BZP didn't stop there. It seeped into music, fashion, media. There were songs referencing party pills, DJ sets practically sponsored by pill brands, and entire club nights themed around the BZP lifestyle. People wore glow-in-the-dark bracelets, chewed gum like it was oxygen, and grinned through clenched teeth at 2 a.m. like everything in life finally made sense. You could argue that this was the most democratized drug moment in recent memory. No criminal record needed, no shady deals. You could be a straight-A student, a delivery driver, a bartender, or a bored accountant, and still find yourself raving in a warehouse with your pupils the size of dinner plates, discussing Nietzsche with a stranger in a bucket hat. There were even social etiquette rules that developed around it, like how many to take, when to take them, whether or not to stack with caffeine. People got weirdly philosophical about it. Online forums lit up with debates over the cleanest brands and dosage strategies. Some swore by 2 pills with a bottle of Powerade. Others claimed 3 was the magic number, if you didn't mind the possibility of hugging a traffic cone on the way home. But as the use spread, so did the complications. Not everyone had a good time. First-timers who overdid it found themselves stuck in a loop of anxiety and nausea. Some users described the crash as brutal, like being hit with a wave of exhaustion and depression all at once. What went up came down, hard. Still, the sheer scale of the cultural moment is hard to overstate. BZP wasn't just a drug, it was a phenomenon. It defined a certain era for thousands of people, especially in New Zealand. It blurred the lines between legal and illicit, between work and party, between control and chaos. It was this bizarre hybrid of health supplement, productivity booster, and chemical playground. And for a while it felt like it was everywhere. And of course, whenever something becomes too popular, it starts to attract attention from the people in charge. Parents started to worry. Doctors began to speak out. News segments ran dramatic stories about teenagers collapsing on dance floors or hallucinating in parking lots. One infamous headline read, "Legal high sends youth into violent frenzy," which, to be fair, is not exactly what it said on the label. But before the bans, before the regulations, before the headlines screamed panic, there was this golden, chaotic window where an entire country seemed to be dancing to the same beat, and that beat was powered by a stimulant once left for dead in a lab drawer. BZP had become part of the culture, and like any cultural moment driven by chemistry and capitalism, it was only a matter of time before things got messy. The highs and the hallucinations. At first, the highs were the headline. BZP made you feel alive, supercharged, chatty, euphoric, alert. You could dance for 6 hours straight, talk to 10 strangers, and still have the focus to recite your grocery list backward. For a generation of users, it was the perfect party accessory. No hangover, no criminal risk, no sketchy alleyway purchases. Just pop a pill, drink some water, and let the night unfold. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. See, BZP doesn't just stimulate you. It jacks up your central nervous system like a toddler with espresso and a firecracker. Users reported teeth grinding, dry mouth, muscle tension, and the kind of sweating usually reserved for marathons and job interviews. There was the come down, the body's messy hormonal attempt to claw its way back to equilibrium after hours of artificial elevation. For some, it was just fatigue, a bit of tiredness, maybe a headache, nothing dramatic. But for others, it hit like a brick. We're talking anxiety, mood crashes, irritability, nausea, insomnia, the full emotional hangover, the kind that makes you regret everything, including your own birth. And then there were the hallucinations. Now, BZP wasn't designed to be psychedelic. It wasn't like LSD or mushrooms. But when taken in high doses, or mixed with alcohol, or taken by someone particularly sensitive, it could send the brain into a tailspin. People started reporting bizarre visual distortions. One guy said he saw neon ants crawling across his ceiling. Another described feeling like his skin was made of zippers. Not ideal when you're trying to enjoy a night out. There's one case that gets cited often. A teenager who took several BZP pills at a house party, passed out on the lawn, and woke up screaming because he thought the grass was whispering to him. Imagine trying to explain that to the ambulance crew. And yet, many users kept going back, because for all the weird side effects, the high itself was still addictive, Not chemically, necessarily, but psychologically. People liked how it made them feel, or rather, how it made them forget what they were feeling before. It became a crutch, a release valve, a way to check out of boredom or stress or sadness and plug into something brighter and louder and faster. There were even people using BZP for weight loss. Not officially, of course. You weren't going to find it listed next to protein shakes and diet plans. But word got around. Appetite suppression is a known effect of stimulants, and some users found that 1 or 2 pills could replace an entire meal. Of course, it also replaced sleep, hydration, and eventually their sense of reality. The scary part was how quickly the doses escalated. The first time you take BZP, half a pill might light you up like a Christmas tree. But after a few weekends, 1 pill becomes 2, 2 becomes 4. And by that point your body isn't bouncing, it's begging for mercy. Doctors started seeing more cases of toxicity, elevated heart rates, chest pains, severe anxiety, even seizures. Emergency departments weren't overwhelmed, but the trend was worrying. And what complicated everything was the drug's legality. These weren't hardened drug users showing up at hospitals. They were regular people, many of them under 25, who had no idea they were playing with something far riskier than advertised. One ER nurse in Wellington described a weekend shift where 5 separate BZP users came in, 2 with panic attacks, 1 with dehydration, 1 with a dangerously fast heartbeat, and 1 who had punched a mailbox because he thought it was looking at him funny. That's not just a bad trip. That's a red flag parade. Some users also began to experience lingering mental health effects, episodes of depression, chronic anxiety, brain fog that didn't clear up after a good night's sleep. The longer you used, the more unpredictable the after effects became. For a drug that was marketed as fun but safe, the risks were creeping in fast. And yet, there were still defenders. People who swore BZP was better than alcohol, safer than meth, cleaner than street pills. And maybe, in some ways, it was. But the line between use and misuse was paper thin. All it took was 1 bad batch, 1 extra pill, 1 long night. And suddenly, the miracle compound from the corner store became a neurological time bomb. Health agencies started issuing warnings. Hotlines were flooded with calls from panicked users, and the public's view began to shift. What once seemed like a clever legal workaround was starting to look like a reckless chemical experiment being conducted on an entire generation. BZP promised energy, euphoria, connection, and it delivered. But the crash that followed was darker, sharper, and more lasting than anyone expected. And the government? They were watching, listening, waiting for the data. The party wasn't over yet, but the lights were flickering. The legal backlash and the fall of BZP. By the mid-2000s, BZP had gone from curious compound to cultural juggernaut. And now, it was facing the inevitable, the legal hammer. At first, the government didn't quite know what to do. This wasn't heroin, it wasn't cocaine, it wasn't even meth. The drug BZP was supposedly helping people avoid. This was a chemical that had once been tested as a worming treatment for cows, quietly shelved, and now somehow resurrected as a party staple for suburban teenagers and bored accountants. The fact that it was legal, that was part of the chaos. There were no clandestine labs in the hills, no cartels, no code names, just brightly colored packaging, online stores, and a population of users who genuinely thought they were doing the right thing by not turning to harder substances. But that didn't stop the side effects from piling up. Emergency departments were logging more visits. Reports of panic attacks, insomnia, seizures, psychosis. They all began to stack up like bricks in a very shaky foundation. The media caught wind. Suddenly, every nightly news bulletin had its BZP horror story. Teens hallucinating in the street, young professionals collapsing in nightclubs, parents begging for the government to step in. And politicians, well, Nothing catches a lawmaker's attention like a public outcry involving kids and drugs. The debates ramped up. Should BZP be banned outright? Should it be regulated like alcohol or tobacco? Or should New Zealand blaze a new trail, one where synthetic drugs could be tested, labeled and sold safely in a legal marketplace? That last option was risky. Forward-thinking, yes, but politically radioactive. Behind the scenes, agencies like the Ministry of Health were conducting reviews, publishing risk assessments, and consulting toxicologists. It turned out that BZP's margin of safety wasn't as wide as its sellers had hoped. The more you took, the closer you got to the danger zone, and because tolerance built quickly, people were pushing those boundaries without realizing it. In 2005, New Zealand took a middle road. They classified BZP as a restricted substance, a new legal category designed to slow down the spread without banning it outright. Under the new rules, BZP couldn't be sold to minors, couldn't be advertised in certain ways, and had to carry warning labels. But the restriction didn't kill the market, not even close. Party pills were still flying off the shelves, websites still offered next-day delivery, and enforcement spotty at best. The industry continued to thrive, although now it was operating in a legal grey area, with the sword of prohibition dangling overhead. Then came the studies. Universities, hospitals, and health boards began publishing detailed reports showing the potential neurological and psychological harms of BZP. One paper pointed out the similarity between BZP and amphetamines in terms of brain chemistry. Another highlighted its unpredictable effects when mixed with alcohol, a combo that was incredibly common on weekends. Public opinion started to shift. What had once been seen as a smart, even responsible alternative to street drugs now looked like a dangerous loophole being exploited for profit. Parents grew louder, doctors grew angrier, the media smelled blood. And so, in 2007, the writing was on the wall. The government moved to ban BZP outright. Not restrict, not regulate, ban, full stop. The industry fought back. Matt Bowden, the so-called godfather of BZP, went on a media blitz. He argued that banning BZP would send users back to meth and untested street pills. He proposed a regulatory framework, complete with safety testing and age restrictions, a bold, progressive idea ahead of its time. But the momentum had shifted. Facts were one thing, fear was another. And fear, as history shows us time and time again, is a powerful legislator. In April 2008, BZP became a Class C controlled substance in New Zealand. Possession became illegal. Distribution, criminal. The entire legal high industry that had grown from nothing in under a decade was now flattened overnight. Websites went offline. Stock was pulled from shelves. Suppliers disappeared, some rebranding, some vanishing completely. And just like that, the party was over. Or was it? Even after the ban, BZP lingered in the culture. Black market versions popped up. Online forums kept the flame alive, with users reminiscing about their glory days on party pills. And of course, chemists didn't stop innovating. BZP's fall simply opened the door to the next wave. Synthetic cannabinoids, bath salts, research chemicals, all just waiting for their moment in the sun before the next crackdown. But BZP was different. It wasn't just a drug. It was a social experiment, a policy question, a cultural turning point. It asked, what happens when you make a stimulant legal, popular, and accessible to everyone? The answer, a moment of euphoria, a wave of chaos, and eventually the same story we've seen play out time and time again. Rise, hype, panic, ban. BZP had its moment. And then, like smoke after a rave, it vanished. Legacy, lessons, and the strange future of legal highs. So, what's left after the high wears off? The shelves are cleared, and the headlines move on. What remains when the substance is banned? the businesses fold, and the cultural wave crashes. BZP didn't just vanish. It left behind a footprint. Not just in legal books or ER reports, but in people's lives, in the way we think about drugs, and in how governments approach substances that exist in the grey space between medicine, mischief, and madness. Its legacy is tangled. On one hand, BZP is remembered as reckless, a cautionary tale of what happens when you let untested chemicals flood the market with little oversight and even less understanding. A stimulant pulled from the animal medicine cabinet was suddenly being handed to teenagers at music festivals. The fact that no one saw that as a red flag at the time still baffles experts today. On the other hand, there was something almost visionary about that moment. For a brief flash in the early 2000s, New Zealand became a living laboratory for what a legal high market might look like. There were brands, customer reviews, competitive pricing, marketing campaigns. There were even discussions about quality control and consumer rights. No cartels, no back alleys, just capitalism, turbocharged, rainbow-coloured, and a little bit sweaty. And this is where the story gets weird, because BZP's death didn't end the legal high industry. It reshaped it, drove it underground, forced it to evolve. You take one chemical off the shelf, two more show up with slightly different structures and the same promises. The rise and fall of BZP was like the opening act of a much stranger show. In the years that followed, we saw the explosion of synthetic cannabinoids, the chaos of bath salts, and an entire market of research chemicals sold under vague labels like "not for human consumption." These weren't safer. In many cases, they were more dangerous, less studied, more potent, and harder to regulate. It turns out, when you slam a door shut on one drug, it doesn't lock out the demand. It just pushes that demand toward the next available window, no matter how sketchy it is. But here's the real kicker. BZP could have been a moment to change course. Some experts argued for regulation instead of prohibition, a framework where substances like BZP could be tested, labeled, sold responsibly, and studied for their risks and their potential benefits. A system built not on fear, but on facts. Instead, we repeated the cycle: popularity, panic, prohibition. It's a loop we've seen with alcohol, cannabis, ecstasy, and now, even with newer drugs like kratom and Delta-8. The pattern is almost rhythmic. First, society ignores the drug. Then it experiments. Then it panics. Then it bans. Then, years later, it wonders if things could have been handled differently. BZP was also a personal turning point for a lot of people. Some users came away with unforgettable nights, wild stories, friendships formed at sunrise on dance floors and in flat kitchens at 4 a.m. Others walked away with regret. Physical scars, mental health struggles, relationships frayed by overuse. It was a roll of the dice, and nobody handed you the rules when you bought the pills. For the people who sold it, BZP was a gold rush. A business built overnight, and then dismantled just as quickly. Some entrepreneurs made a fortune. Others lost everything. A few moved on to other synthetic ventures, playing a constant game of chemical cat and mouse with lawmakers. For policymakers, it was a case study in what happens when drug laws are reactive instead of proactive, when we wait for things to go wrong before we step in, when science takes a back seat to moral panic, when the war on drugs keeps forgetting that the battlefield is filled with real people. And for everyone else, it's just one more bizarre chapter in the ever-growing book of human chemistry experiments, a reminder that substances, legal or illegal, carry stories with them. Stories of risk, of escape, of economy, of control. Stories that don't always end neatly, but always teach us something. BZP may not be a household name anymore, but for a moment it held up a mirror to society, showing us what we chase, what we fear, and how quickly we try to shut the door once things get out of hand. And that is exactly what Substances Through Time is all about. Not just the drug, but the people, the culture, the chaos, the choices. So whether it's pills from a corner shop, leaves from a jungle, or compounds brewed in underground labs, these substances shape us, and in return we shape them, through science, through laws, through stories passed down from one generation of partiers, policymakers and curious minds to the next. BZP is gone, but the questions it raised, they're still very much alive. Thanks for taking this wild ride with us through the rise and fall of BZP. We hope you enjoyed the deep dive into another bizarre and fascinating chapter of drug history, brought to you by Substances Through Time. If you found this story interesting, weird, or just plain unbelievable, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. Got a drug, substance, or strange chemical trend you want us to explore next? Drop a comment below. We read them all, and we love hearing your suggestions. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, every substance has a story.